Hello, everyone. I am Phillip Sipiora, professor of English and Film Studies at the University of South Florida. Today, I am honored to have a conversation with Professor Gary Rhodes, an acclaimed film historian who teaches at the University of Central Florida, Nicholson School of Communication and Mass Media. Professor Rhodes has been involved in professional filmmaking for over 2 decades, his work ranging from writing and directing films to managing production companies. And he is also the author or editor of approximately 24 books and has published numerous scholarly journal essays. Welcome, Professor Rhodes.
Thanks very much, Dr. Sipiora. I really appreciate your having me here.
Okay. I would like to begin our conversation by asking you to look back into your deep historical knowledge of cinema and identify, relatively briefly, the 1 or 2 most significant technical advances that have had a profound influence on the emergence of film as an art form.
Well, that's a wonderful question. I would say that the introduction of sound would be the first of the 2 I would mention. You know, one of my favorite filmmakers is Stanley Kubrick, and Kubrick was famous for generally being secretive, not giving very many interviews, but earlier in his career, he did give some interviews, and at one point he was asked, can you please draft a list of what you think are the best films ever made? And he did. And the journalist noted that his list did not include any silent films and asked him about it. And Kubrick said, well, I'd have to put those on a separate list. I'm paraphrasing what he said, but he basically said, I'd have to put those on a separate list because they're so different. Silent films are so different than sound. I use that anecdote as a way to get inside the first of the 2 examples I would give, or the first of the 2 kind of inflection points of major technological shifts. Certainly, we know that Thomas Edison and W.K.L. Dixon were trying to work with sound from the very beginnings of their inventions in the 1890s. There were various attempts at sound, certainly very many successful attempts at sound in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. One of the biggest problems was actually also being able to play back the sound in a theater hall with hundreds or thousands of people such that they could hear it. But the introduction of sound, which was a process that in a major kind of mainstream way really takes place between about 1926 and 1930-31. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen with one film. But once we moved from silent to sound film, that's one of the technological changes I would think to be the most important, because it changed just about everything. I believe we can even feel it now. Those of us, obviously, most film viewers in the world that grew up in an era of sound, as we tried to watch silent films initially, certainly even adapting to that process of just being a viewer. Now, sound changed just about everything. Even the phrase sound stage, you know, at studios, or quiet on the set. These were unnecessary phrases and so forth before sound became a key part of filmmaking. So that would be one of the 2 that I would mention. The other, since you've kindly asked for 2, the other I would point to would be the advent of home video. Most of film history involved viewers, audience members going to a theater or some venue, mainly a movie theater, what we would call a movie theater, and they would have to go in at an appointed time. They would have to watch what was on the schedule. At most, you could go, excuse me, to a different theater, but depending upon where you were, you would have had very limited choices. You had to see the film at the certain time. You could not pause. You could not rewind. You could not watch it a second time unless you bought a second ticket. And within a small number of days, a couple of weeks at most, the film schedule would change, and even buying a second ticket wouldn't allow you to see that same film again. Even as a kid of the late 1970s, I remember when Star Wars was released, but I also remember when it was reissued and it came back to theaters. I believe it was in 79 after having first been released in 77. And it was so extraordinarily exciting because here's this opportunity to see a film again. I remember also the feeling of, even for television broadcasts, if you wanted to watch a film on television, the quote late movie or otherwise, you had to be there at the appointed time. If there was a commercial break, you would have to quickly make your sandwich to be back before the film restarted. I actually remember setting alarm clocks, to get up in the middle of the night sometimes to see an extremely rare film, because, and this is key to everything I'm talking about, I think, because you never knew if you had a chance to see it again. It was time-based in so many respects. The advent of home video, and maybe more particularly its proliferation, because certainly Sony launched a home recorder in the 1970s, but so very expensive, most people could not have afforded it. They did not buy them. Families, mine, so many millions across America and the world, until the 1980s. And I believe that changed everything about being a film viewer, as well as in some respects filmmaking. All of a sudden you could not just be the viewer, but you could be the exhibitor. You could be the manager of your own theater inside your home. You could push play when you wanted. You could rewatch the film. You could rewatch it when you wanted. You could rewatch only part of it, the same scene repeatedly. If something caught your eye and you were curious about what was in the background of a film, you could importantly push pause. This leads, of course, through Betamax and VHS and the early iterations, through DVD, through Blu-ray, through streaming. On demand is an interesting phrase, I think, in this context, because it is the viewer that makes the demands rather than the filmmakers and certainly the film theaters being in control of when and only when we can watch a given film. Those would be the two moments, I think, the two real inflection points in film history, that while there are so many important changes technologically, and something, as we would say as a historian, something's always evolving into something else. There's always change. But those would be the two that I would first want to speak about.
Well, thank you for those insights. If we might turn the same question to horror cinema, would you be able to briefly talk about two critical turning points? Because you've been writing and researching horror cinema for decades, so this is right in your wheelhouse.
Yes, well, thanks for that question. Excuse me, I have written and researched horror films for much of my life and career, and the interesting thing about horror, I think, over many other genres, whether it's the musical or the Western, horror has been relatively consistently popular from the 1890s to the present. Some other genres like musicals, kind of disappear for sometimes many years at a time. Horror has been quite consistently popular. There's been many, many evolutions and changes. Excuse me, but I'm happy to give a couple of the most important moments. I think one would be, I would look towards 1931 and early 1932. In 1931, Universal Pictures, which of course still exists, it's still one of the most important studios, the theme parks, including in Florida, certainly Southern California, very well known for their horror films. They're trying, as we speak here in 2020, they're trying yet again to reboot their legacy in horror, as they've tried to do recently with the film The Invisible Man, which they first made in 1933. I would look towards Universal in 1931 and 32. They made, in the sound era, which builds off of what we were just talking about, they made first Dracula in 1931. It was released on right around Valentine's Day of 1931. And then they proceeded to make Frankenstein later in 1931. released later that year. I point to those two films because it was those two films that caused, not studios first, at least, not filmmakers or film directors at first, at least, but it's those two films caused critics, film critics at newspapers across the country, as well as everyday audience members, to look at them. They were successful films, they were popular films. But the thing that is most interesting, I think, that happened, and we see it happening first in the spring of 31, but throughout the rest of the year and into the 1932, audiences and film critics really developed the phrase, the name, horror film, and by extension, horror movie. Quote, horror film, that was not something people generally said before 1931. Even though spooky pictures, we might call them, existed before, it wasn't until 1931-32 that the horror film gets its name. And this is extremely important because with a film name comes certain audience expectations. A shorthand name like Western, musical, horror film, they allow audiences to speak to one another in shorthand in ways that they understand what they're talking about. They understand what advertising in those couple of words like horror movie, what it means. Now, to get a name is important, whether we're naming a baby, a pet, or in this case, a film genre. So that's one of the two. I would also, if we were to give a second kind of real major pivot point in horror film history, although there's many, I would probably point towards certainly the 1960s in general. And I would point out films particularly like Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho from 1960 and George Romero's Night of the Living Dead from 1968. What we start to see happening in the 1960s is a turn towards much more visceral gore, as it's sometimes called in the industry and by horror film buffs. Splatter is a term that starts getting used more in the 1970s, but the greater emphasis, in other words, on blood being depicted visually, a great deal of blood, dismemberment of human beings with special effects. And this all happens thanks to films like Psycho and Night of the Living Dead, and certainly into the 70s then with films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974. Halloween in 1978. And it coincides, and it's not a mistake, but it coincides really with kind of the breakdown of the old censorship of Hollywood, such that those kinds of things were allowable to be seen in mainstream, relatively mainstream films at everyday movie theaters.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And your reference to films from earlier eras remind me that we've both been teaching film for a long time, yet I think that we continually face a common challenge. How do you make old films relevant to today's students born after the year 2000?
Well, I think that's a tremendous question, and it is a real challenge, and it's one that I understand. It's one that's important for us to think about, because with all of the great love students and younger people have for the cinema, it's often based upon the films they saw when they were little children. I was the same way, as well as films, through the teenage years and high school and to the present day. Of course, we all maybe look forward to going to the movie theater or seeing a new release or the anticipation of a new forthcoming film. And so how then does one make exciting? How does one get excited about a film from before the time we were born, for example, before not only we were alive, but maybe many decades earlier, films even before our parents were alive or even grandparents at this point in film history? I think film history can be certainly extremely exciting, even fun, if we let it. There are certainly some genres that we love, that younger people love, whether it's superhero films that, depending upon how we want to define them start in the 1930s or 40s. The first horror film, to return to that discussion, is made in 1895. So one thing to consider, I think, is that a lot of the most popular genres, even of today, they do have this long history and these deep roots. So they've been loved, these genres, for many, many, many decades. In fact, as I said, you know, you have Universal thinking about making Dracula now, even though it first did in 1931. I think for those students, and it's so many of them, wonderfully, who want to make films or write films, it becomes crucial to know film history, because you not only realize and understand as you grasp the history, at least in broad brushstrokes, you not only begin to understand what's been done before, but that's helpful for two reasons. For aspiring filmmakers, screenwriters, it's crucial for two reasons, and it can be exciting, I think, for two reasons. One of them is that you don't accidentally reinvent the wheel. You don't come up with an idea for a film and unbeknownst to you, it was actually made as a film 5, 10 times before. The other thing, though, is that there's certainly ways to appropriate from the past in a meaningful, exciting, and certainly legitimate way, not plagiarism, but just learning from past master filmmakers, great films. Quentin Tarantino, I think, becomes a great way into that discussion, where he's making these incredible films that are from his own imagination, but they're deeply informed by the past. So there's tremendous ideas we can get, I think, from earlier points in film.
Okay, let's turn to culture, which is surely an architectural term in film studies today. Cinematic representations of culture are now, I think, acutely significant in the classroom. Do you feel that contemporary cinema is effective in depicting a sufficient range of cultures, subcultures, and cultural interrelationships, considering the powerful matrix of cultural nuances and implications of today's times?
Well, I think that's an extremely important question. And excuse me, certainly I think there are tremendous things happening globally. I spent many years abroad, living in Western Europe, and including, you know, in Ireland, where there was scarcely a film industry in Ireland for the first 80 to 90 years of the cinema. There was scarcely an industry in Ireland. Now there's a tremendous industry there, where Irish people are getting to depict themselves, in other words, rather than purely being depicted by the eyes of other national cinemas. So there's some tremendous things happening. I myself am a Native American. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. There's tremendous work being done by young Native American filmmakers. However, and that I think could be said in so many ways about so many great places around the world, but it's not true in so many respects of Hollywood and the highest budget filmmaking, what we might call, for better or worse, mainstream filmmaking. You know, those multi-million-dollar films that are the ones that populate, certainly in non-pandemic periods, that populate the local movie theaters, the blockbusters, you know, those kinds of films. There is tremendous work that has to be done in Hollywood, expanding the kinds of depictions of people culturally. Not only their stories, but behind the camera, in front of the camera, there's a tremendous amount of work that Hollywood needs to do, even as peoples around the world are picking up cameras and making their own independent films, which is extremely exciting.
Okay. As you mentioned, you are a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and you have obviously experienced from birth two diverse cultures. I'm particularly interested in how does your ethnicity influence, at least consciously, your teaching, writing, and film production work, especially in the ways that your work reveals and reflects a sort of intertwining intermixing of your personal culture and your professional aesthetic interpretation and representation of culture and cultures?
Excuse me. Well, again, that's a tremendous question. And I think for ethnic minorities in America and elsewhere around the world, there is a feeling from youth where you feel both inside and outside of a culture. You feel part of the larger group, but then you also, by difference, feel a little bit like you're on the outside looking in always. In terms of the cinema, this is, I think, deeply problematic in terms of Native Americans, because there have been very few Native American directors in Hollywood. A couple of those that have worked in Hollywood decades ago, like Edwin Carew and his brother Wallace Fox, they were generally making films not about Native Americans, but other subjects, just popular Hollywood fare. In terms of the depictions of Native Americans, certainly in my writing and my work and some of the things I'm working on these days, it would be, on the one hand, to interrogate, even to I think, condemn, some of the depictions of Native Americans, most of them really from the past, say, 120, 25 years in the cinema, as well as to lobby for more Native American film festivals, more Native American filmmakers. The best stories, I think, about Native Americans, and I think that this is also true of so many peoples around the world and other ethnic minorities, the best stories about Native Americans are the stories that Native Americans can and should tell. Native American screenwriters, Native American directors, Native American cinematographers and actors. For the bulk of American film history, Native Americans on screen were obviously stereotyped as savages, as scalping the white man, that kind of thing. Cowboys and Indians pictures, as they were often called. The first times Native Americans were even depicted on films, one as early as about 1894, it was scalping, and it was special effects. It was fiction. Scalping a white person, So these kinds of ongoing, depictions are problematic, stereotypical, cliched, and frankly, in most cases, horrible. The other side of the coin is that so often the Native Americans were not only being depicted wrongly, but they were being played by non-Native Americans. Often in makeup. It was called red facing, often in makeup. Probably the actor best known for playing Native Americans in the 20th century probably was Iron Eyes Cody, who was in fact actually Italian, of Italian descent. He wasn't Native American, even though some of the images of him, particularly one in the 1970s where he was seen dressed in Native American attire and kind of crying, a tear coming down his face as he saw, the poor treatment of the environment, people not picking up trash and everything. And yet here was certainly a very talented actor, but certainly a non-Native American playing Native American characters one time after another. So for me, I think this is an incredibly wonderful crossroads we're at to try and lobby for, to take advantage of this moment to try and lobby for depictions of people on screen that are more authentic, that are being depicted, in fact, by directors who are from said ethnic minorities. This is a wonderful moment to take advantage of, because the history of Hollywood has been something quite, unfortunately, the reverse.
Those are some excellent and stimulating points. Let me follow up in terms of, do you see an increase in attention not only to Native American cinematic production, but also to scholarship, to student interest? When you deal with your students, is this an area that you see increased attention being devoted to?
Well, I think that's a wonderful point, and I believe that it's a growing area. Certainly, Native American cinema is growing strongly, even though it's more in terms of independent and low budget films. I think that really from the late '90s and the filmmaker Chris Eyre and films of his like Smoke Signals to the present, we see an ever greater number of young student filmmakers, Native American filmmakers, making films, more festivals, Native American theme festivals at which to play them. All my years in Ireland working with students, there were some students, some graduate students who were very fascinated by Native American cinema. And so I think that there's a growing number of scholars and student scholars working in the area. Major strides are being made. There's a lot more to be done, and I think it goes hand in hand with the growing amount of film productions in this area. That the more, in other words, the more Native American films that get made, in all likelihood, that will mean the more students and scholars that will be interested, in them. I mean, we're still in an era where a few years ago, a film like The Lone Ranger, features Johnny Depp, an actor I quite like, but Johnny Depp playing a Native American. And I think, we hope in future to see more Native American actors playing those parts. And that, I think, also will spur more interest among students and scholars.
Okay. I know that you're completing a book on Wallace Fox, Native American filmmaker, and I'm wondering if you could speak briefly as to the sorts of scholarship that you're doing in that book and what you hope to achieve with the publication of this book.
Well, thank you very much for that, because the Wallace Fox book we've been working on, it's going to be an anthology, where scholars around the world come together and contribute meaningfully to a particular subject, in this case, Wallace Fox. And Fox was born not very far from where I was born, in the state of Oklahoma. He was a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. He was a Chickasaw. He had two brothers. Another brother of his became a director. Wallace Fox became a director. The third brother was a screenwriter. And Fox worked as a director really from the late 1920s through the 1950s, often in low-budget films, but Hollywood films. I mean, his films are still screened today, still thought about today. Certainly those of us involved in the book, including yourself, Dr. Sipiora, because you're an important part of that book, are, interested in his films. The interesting feature of, think of somebody like Fox, is that most of the time he was a Native American working in Hollywood, but making films about other topics and non-Native American topics most of the time. In that period in Hollywood, you generally were under contract if you were at a major studio. If you were a bit of a free agent with the independent companies, the Poverty Row studios, they were sometimes called, you really generally didn't have a lot of choice over the films you made. You were just simply told, next week you're making this horror film, the week after you're making this comedy. And so most of the time, I think Fox is interesting because he was only the second Native American film director in history. And for that, I think he deserves attention. But most of the time, he was making films about non-Native American subjects. There were a few instances where he made Westerns, and they included Native American characters. And of course, those become interesting because on the one hand, the director does have a major role in how films come together and how, in this case, Native Americans, fellow Native Americans for him, were depicted. On the other hand, he was hamstrung by things like a script written by somebody else, limited production time, limited money, accepted stereotypes of the era. So he was kind of, between a rock and a hard place, so to speak, making films about Native Americans on the few occasions he was able to do so. This becomes, I think, an interesting part of Hollywood, where we so often concentrate on directors as artists, But throughout film history, whether it was with Wallace Fox as a Native American working in Hollywood, or even really to the present day, we see that directors so often are not solely in control of their films, that there's pressures from all kinds of other people, producers and so forth,
Sure. Well, thank you for that detailed explanation. There is an historical issue that many film scholars have long been interested in, surely you and I, and that is the shifting identification of film art with a, let's call it a categorical medium identity. What I mean by that is that in the first half of the last century, film was often known as an actor's medium. Movies were recognized and defined by the leading actors in them. Then, roughly, beginning in the second half of the last century, films were commonly associated and understood as a director's medium, or as film critics and scholars called it, auteur theory. My students today, especially undergraduates, often associate films with actors whom they admire. And when I taught film for 3 years at the high school level, my high school students had no idea who directed or produced a film. The actors were everything. And to a certain degree, that is still a prevailing sensibility. I'm interested in your thoughts on this shifting cinematic center of gravity, this flow, if it still exists, between actor and or director.
Well, thanks for that, because I have similar views, and I've had similar experiences with students, particularly when I first started teaching in the early 1990s. So many students, so many people, just friends of mine, family members, what have you, people who are not in the film industry or film studies, continue to think about actors, of course. I mean, I believe, to refer back to what I was saying about the advent of the term horror film, another way we could consider that would be the fact that Hollywood cinema, certainly for over 100 years, Hollywood cinema has generally advertised its films using two major methods. One would be genre, the category, the type of film. That's why I returned to the mention of when I said the advent of the phrase horror movie. Well, so one is what kind of film is it, in other words, that an audience may ask, which is a genre question. Is it a Western? Is it this? Is it that? The other is who's in it. What's the film? What's the star of the film? So Hollywood has encouraged people to think in the ways that you're talking about by the marketing strategies, including the star system that's existed in Hollywood for nearly 110 years. So there is this ongoing fascination with actors, and I like this actor, I don't like the other, he or she is my favorite, that kind of thing. But I think you're absolutely right to suggest that there becomes a shift in the certainly in the industry and in scholarship, general film criticism in the second half of the 20th century to auteur theory. And of course, when we say auteur theory, we're meaning the from the French, of course, the word author, and the notion. And there's as a film historian, I know that this notion really starts to form around the year 1900, even though it's not something average audience members are ever thinking about during the first half, not normally, it's at least during the first half of the 20th century, that the director, who is the author of a film, the author of a book, well, that's the writer, the creator of a painting is the painter, but who, when a film is involving the collaboration of so many people, who is the, quote, author of it, auteur, that term. And from the earliest days, the director is generally the one thought of as the key creator, not, in other words, the screenwriter, who might be more closely what we would historically think of as a writer, the person actually writing the script, the dialogue, so forth. not the producer normally. Now there are exceptions. I mean, David O. Selznick in Hollywood was sometimes seen as the leading Sidney Franklin for a little while. There were producers, in other words, that were occasionally seen as Val Lewton at RKO was one of them in the 1940s. Occasionally, in other words, producers were seen as being so much the kind of the puppet master of the films. But in general, directors for the second half of the 20th century to the present have been seen as the author, the key person. I think most film students, if they're interested in film production, there's many, many wonderful things to concentrate on doing, screenwriting, cinematography, but I think so often director is that most highly prized or privileged place, rightly or wrongly, because films are collaborative in nature. I know that the film theorist Edward Buscombe has said provocatively but pointedly, we are all auteurs now. And I think by that he means the sheer weight of auteur theory, certainly from the 1960s to the present day, means that it's almost inescapable, that the notion of the director as being the controlling force, despite the many arguments that were made against the theory from its inception, articulation throughout the decades. Well, another way to put it is most people write books on film directors, not the cinematographers, not the screenwriters, not the producers. There's exceptions. When a film critic, even for a local newspaper, radio station, television station, when they want to give credit or blame for a film, it's the director they speak about. And to an extent, audiences over time have become more familiar with director names as a result of the very thing, Dr. Sipiora, that you pointed out in your question. I mean, you know, the people waiting for maybe the next Christopher Nolan film. A lot of the discussion lately in the industry and fan press about the, quote, Snyder cut of Justice League that will be launched on HBO Max even after Joss Whedon had completed that film initially for theatrical release. So I think, though stars and stardom is still, along with genre, the controlling forces, the major marketing methods used, over time, we've all become, as Buscombe says, to a greater degree or lesser degree, auteurs, you know, thinking about the director. So, wonderful question.
Well, thank you for that that superb answer, which I very much share. And you reminded me of something a student of mine said to me a few years ago. We were talking about actors and directors, and the student said, "Professor, is not the director the straw that stirs the drink?" And I said, "Absolutely." And I'm going to use that metaphor someday. Well, and I've just used it. Okay.
Wonderful.
Thank you. You and I, as friends for decades, fellow teachers, scholars, film fanatics, are concerned about film censorship, as you and I have privately discussed. Can you speak to some of the integral contexts of film censorship in contemporary cinema, particularly since the bygone era of the Hays Code, 1934 to 1968, was clearly so powerful in regulating the art of cinema? Is censorship now dead because of the rise of one, international cinema, and two, file sharing technology?
Wonderful. Well, that's an extremely important question. Excuse me. I would give it a brief historical backdrop, since you mentioned the Hays Code. The interesting feature that of how, if we look at America, and of course that generally means, certainly not always happily, but generally means Hollywood cinema, historically at least. American cinema is interesting in that, even unlike, say, British cinema, American cinema has never had, and I think a lot of people are surprised at the following, American cinema has never had a federally government regulated form of censorship. There were efforts towards that in the early years of the 20th century, where whether it was given topics, prostitution being described or shown in a film, a fictional film, robberies, murders as depicted in fictional films, even prize fighting, boxing images, different things that were seen as untoward or maybe shouldn't be screened, provoked a lot of people towards the thought that there should be governmental censorship. There were in some communities. The city of Chicago's police acted as a film censor for many, many years. The state of Kansas had censorship. New York did. But as far as the federal government having a role in censorship, that was threatened at times. And in fact, it was what led to the Hays Code. The Hollywood studios got together in an effort to thwart or ward off talks that the federal government would censor them. They decided, we'll censor ourselves. We'll come together, all of the major studios, and we will form a self-censorship group. And this led to the Hays Code of what we will or won't show. And so we won't show nudity. We won't use certain words, curse words that, they would have been called, that kind of thing. And so that was how Hollywood acted in a kind of self-censorship way, although it did prohibit lots of different kinds of things from being seen on screen for those many years. And it started breaking down in the 1960s as filmmakers like Otto Preminger, Stanley Kubrick started basically just ignoring the production code in the early 60s because they were able to, at least to the extent that it wasn't mandated by federal law. And that, of course, led to films like Bonnie and Clyde in 1967, which was seen to be so violent, the murders and blood and so forth, that once again, the U.S. government, even Lyndon B. Johnson, the president, started thinking, there should be again government censorship. We've got to step in. This is going out of control. More increased amounts of nudity and blood, and that was what led Hollywood, once again in an act of self-censorship, to develop the movie rating system that we still, with some modification, live with to the present day. The R rating, the PG rating, the G rating, these were developed in 1968, but they still don't have the force of federal law, behind them. So it's been an interesting dance, Hollywood trying to ward off censorship while adopting censorship itself. In other words, to keep the government out of its business, certainly the federal government, but at the same time to impose restrictions on themselves. I do believe censorship in today's world is much more difficult for the reasons that you outline. It's much more difficult because of the sheer low cost of making films and distributing them. Everybody with a cell phone can now make a film and within minutes have it distributed on YouTube or Vimeo, for example, throughout the world. And that's part of that global cinema, that international cinema that you're talking about. I think the fact that file sharing and platforms like YouTube also mean the very same, that if a given country or region tries to ban something on the internet, even if it's taken down the user in one place, another put it up, minutes later. I made a documentary film once called Banned in Oklahoma that was about the banning of a film in the state of Oklahoma. And at a given point, a film was not allowed to be shown or screened, and all the videotapes of this particular film were confiscated from home video rental stores. And that was that would happened in the late 1990s, and that was a period when somebody could literally try, at least, to go into every home, every rental store, and confiscate the physical property of the said film that's going to be banned. The very kind of file sharing that you're talking about, of course, makes that a difficult process, if not impossible, in today's world. So, so I believe you're absolutely correct that censorship for the future, certainly in most countries of the world, it's more difficult than ever to impose restrictions, other than the kind of informal censorship of audience members on us just saying, I don't want to see X, I don't want to see Y. And that doesn't make the copies of a film that violates their interests or morality disappear. It just means that nobody's watching the film, you know, that audience members can censor things by simply not watching them if they disapprove of them.
Okay, many new questions, I think, are continuously being raised over this issue. I would like to ask you about contemporary cinema. One of the most popular movies in my current film and culture course is Wonder Woman. Do you see this film, so brilliantly developed by director Patty Jenkins and Wonder Woman herself, Gal Gadot, indicative of a new tide of action films? If yes, why and how so?
Well, that's very fascinating, and I do hope it's indicative of new types of films and filmmaking. I very strongly hope that, because in the same way that I earlier said, you know, there's been so few Native American film directors in history, for the broad length of Hollywood film history, there's been very few women directors. And so hopefully, and I do believe that this is, again, possible. I think we are at an inflection point where Hollywood is finally coming to grips with the need to be more inclusive, and inclusive behind the camera, in front of the camera. What I hope is that directors like Jenkins are continuing to pave the way for more and more women directors, and for more and more films featuring women in roles other than the roles women had on screen for so many decades, meaning that we see more and more women as action heroes or superheroes. We see more and more women in action films, in all kinds of films. I think to an extent, perhaps the recent Star Wars, the latest trilogy, does this with Daisy Ridley's character, that we see more and more women empowered, their characters in films, more and more women from different backgrounds and ethnicities and regions from the world, but and again, both behind and in front and in front of the camera, so that the number of opportunities for women expand. And then I think this becomes, as a result, inspiring. I said earlier about, you know, watching films as a little kid. That's where I think a lot of us develop our love for the cinema initially, you know, that we become excited about films when we're 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old and beyond. But I think these kinds of films, where they can be so valuable, is not only at the present time, but in the future, meaning that they inspire more and more children, to become filmmakers later, and see what's possible in ways that maybe wasn't generally possible decades ago.
Well, thank you for those incisive comments. Along the same line, I've been thinking about another film that I use in my course, either as part of the viewing schedule or as a film upon which they could write a term essay. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on Barry Jenkins' powerful coming-of-age 2016 film, Moonlight, which we know was set in Florida, shot in Florida, and of course won Best Picture of the Year.
Well, yes, absolutely. I think that's a tremendous film to screen for all kinds of reasons. One of them, obviously, the setting being in Florida, and I think there have been some wonderful films set in Florida recently. Another would be The Florida Project, I think, is worth mentioning in that regard. And I think the film, to return to an earlier question of yours, it becomes an insight into many things, including, and it's just one of many, including into film history. Because if we take just the fact it's set in Florida and filmed in Florida, some of the earliest film companies in the 1910s and 20s, there was a vibrant film industry in Florida over 100 years ago. There was even a feeling at that time with various companies shooting films here, film company, that maybe Florida had as much a chance to be what Hollywood became as Hollywood. So there's a wonderful feature, I think, there, and I think to the cinema focusing on areas outside of California, for example. As much as I love California, to the other regions, states, whether in this country or around the world, are depicted. I think we also see the great joy in seeing ethnicities, different orientations being depicted positively, authentically, in ways that simply weren't happening years ago. The fact it's a coming-of-age film, though, makes me also think about the possibilities of seeing it as part of a continuum. Whether it's coming-of-age films like Rebel Without a Cause in the 1950s, Nicholas Ray's film, or perhaps maybe more so, I would think about Rhodes' film from 1959. And as I recall, Moonlight ends with the character as a child at the beach, which is exactly where, in one of the most famous freeze frames in cinema history, and this is a spoiler, but that's something that sometimes happens in film studies courses. One of the most famous freeze frames in film history is the freeze frame that ends the 400 Blows with the character in that coming of age film at the beach, and which brings to mind not only film history, but all kinds of implications, philosophical. We think of what Hegel said about the beach or otherwise. So I think it's tremendous that films like Moonlight, in that in some respects, they're part of interesting trajectories of say, history, even narrative, philosophical traditions. On the other hand, they're part of this wonderfully modern movement towards depicting, again, ethnic minorities, different people of different backgrounds and orientations in ways and in positive respects that simply weren't present in mainstream cinema for most of its history. So part of it draws on the past and part of it breaks with the past. And what could be more wonderful, I think, than that?
Okay, thank you. I very much appreciate those comments, because I too have always seen film and taught film or tried to teach film as the most dynamic art form we have, which tells us so much about our human successes and failures, as well as our deepest desires in film and fears. And I think ultimately, film at its best teaches us about ourselves as we think and analyze and emote and respond. I think that it's such an important general learning principle. I have two questions left. The first of these two would be to ask you to please look into your crystal ball and let us know your thoughts about the future of film, if this can be done in a relatively brief manner.
Well, that's predicting the future, I have to admit, has not been something I'm usually successful at least in my own life. It's not a particularly profitable task for any of us, perhaps, but nevertheless, we do it. And it's fascinating, and it's part of film history too. That I was reading just the other day from an old 1920 article. The film will be like 100 years later, and the predictions in that article are not what film is like, generally speaking, 100 years later, which is this very year, 2020. So we're so often wrong. But what I do see happening, and I do believe about the future, I'll say two or three things. One of them is that I've done some interviews lately about the pandemic and its effect on movie theaters, and will it mean the end of movie theaters? I've been interviewed about that somewhat because of a book I wrote called The Perils of Moviegoing in America that was about, communicable disease and other dangers like movie theater fires and so forth throughout film history. So public safety and health and moviegoing. I will say that I'm happy to predict, and I believe it will be true, that though some particular theater chains, and most specifically AMC, will likely go out of business, I do not believe that the end of public film exhibition is upon us. I believe that for a variety of reasons, there will still continue to be, with as much as people watch things at home, streaming, and so forth, on demand, that there will continue to be the desire, whether it's film festivals or simply going to the local movie theater. I believe that aspect of life, that recreational time activity, will continue, and for a lot of reasons, not least of which is that younger people are always going to want to go somewhere. High school students, I remember this as a high school student, I believe it's true now. High school students will want to get out of the home. They'll want to get away from the TV in the living room and their parents, at least for a few hours here and there. And the movie theater becomes an optimal place, one of maybe many, to go. I think that, so I do believe that despite the greatest fears of some in the industry at this moment, and this really tragic, horrendous moment of this pandemic, I do believe that the movie theater, even if some will shut down, there will be bankruptcies, I do believe public film exhibitions will continue. So that's one prediction. Another prediction, and I think it's even more optimistic, is that I do believe so much of what we've talked about, that this inflection point of the moment, whether it's with films like Wonder Woman and directors like Jenkins, whether it's with so many others, Jordan Peele, in terms of my interest in horror, is so exciting, of course, that we will continue to see Hollywood finally doing more and more towards inclusivity, where we will see more and more people in front and behind the camera telling more and more stories, more realistically, authentically about more and more groups of people, whether it's Native Americans or otherwise. I do believe, in other words, that the future is bright in terms of Hollywood cinema and its greater recognition and positive inclusivity of minorities of all types, whether it's orientations, ethnic minorities, and so forth. So I believe there's great days ahead. I really do see the future of film very optimistically.
Well, I share that, and thank you for those insights. And it's probably a good idea for both of us to put the crystal ball away for a little while. Let me turn to my last question, which I believe is somewhat less daunting. What does the future hold for Gary Rhodes? Which projects are high on your list?
Well, thanks for that question, because I always love to talk about myself. So thanks for that question. I certainly will be continuing my work as a film historian. I'll be continuing my work on horror film cinema. I'll be continuing to work with you, I'm sure, on joint projects, which is wonderful. But of course, and because it's such a great joy to collaborate with you, and as I hope your students know, there are scholars from Western Europe, so many places I know that appreciate your work so very greatly. So I hope to do so many things. I think one aspect of what I want to do more of, though, rather than talk about just one particular project, is maybe a particular approach. I've made documentaries before, documentary films about film history, and I want to do more of that, because as great as books can be as a medium to analyze and talk about film, I believe that there are increasing possibilities of all types for, at very little cost, and with great possible dissemination in ways that are maybe sometimes more engaging to modern students, to modern critics, to those who love film, to take what you and I have traditionally done as published essays and books and do more of it through, well, really through what you and I are doing right now with this interview, but by embedding film clips, you know, doing what, say, filmmakers like Kevin Brownlow have done so well for years, doing sometimes at least what we might do in a book or essay, but doing it through documentary films instead. You know, film is an audiovisual medium. Writing is not. So, you know, even trying to sometimes describe a particular scene in an essay or a book, if you can show it to people, obviously it is the scene and it's more impactful. So I hope that as a discipline, as a field, that film criticism, film theory, film history, that all of us move increasingly towards those kinds of ways of conveying the information and analysis we're trying to do, but in ways that are more cinematic and that maybe can capture people's attention, we hope, more than books, which are maybe a bit increasingly, though I regret it in some ways myself, maybe a bit more looking towards the past than the future. So that's where I think I'm headed.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Professor Rhodes, for your time, energy, and inspiring insights. There's much for all of us to take away from today's session.
Thank you so very kindly for having me. I really wish your students all the best in their studies and their careers in cinema. We look forward to hearing from all of them.
Okay, thank you. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.